we actually have a group that's looking specifically at this area of how do we get more community-based research, because what we found with COVID is, we did a tremendous amount of research very quickly, but it was highly localized and it was not representative of the entire population. It was representative of the population that was near major medical centers. And so, I really applaud our colleagues from the Department of Health and Human Services, from NIH and elsewhere, who are trying to design broader collaboratives that can bring in researchers from across diverse communities. It's no secret to this audience that we're rediscovering that a person is not a person is not a person, whether it's ethnic differences, genetic differences. We need much more diverse patient population engagement or participation in our research protocols in order to understand what's the best treatment not only for a typical white middle-class male who lives in an urban area, but also for the rest of the population that lives in different parts of our country or around the world. So that's a long-winded way of saying there's not a quick answer to that, but there are, I think, some remarkable efforts underway to develop more inclusive research collaboratives that bring community partners into those so that we can have the infrastructure supporting that work while benefiting from a more diverse patient and clinician involvement.
Thank you very much, and I'm hoping to be part of that solution and get better care for the patients. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, General. Enjoyed your talk a great deal. I'm at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and my job is to find problems and then find technology inside of Livermore where we might help solve that problem. So my question to you is that in the Air Force, I assume your focus is on Air Force personnel and the neurologic problems that they may face due to their unique circumstance. For instance, high G loading on the brain, things like that. What are the problems that you're working on that are unique to your domain of interest?
Well, thank you. And so I'm going to give you another slightly long-winded answer. I left plenty of time for questions. So I'm wearing an Air Force uniform, but I have the great privilege of actually serving as the Joint Staff Surgeon, so I get to work with colleagues across all of the services. And I think, yes, we need to continue to look at domain-specific research. And there's some, clearly tremendous work being done for those who are preparing to go to Mars or to go back to the moon. There's tremendous work being done on undersea medicine, sixth-generation aircraft and what that would look like. But I think the most intriguing part is not domain-specific. It's how do we prevent injury, and that's domain-agnostic. The holy grail right now is not how to treat people after they're injured. It's how do we better identify where there are people who are at increased risk for injury and mitigate that risk. And some of you will have a chance to hear Kathy Lee from our Department of Defense talk about some of the work that we're doing. But we think that's some of the most exciting work out there right now is how do you prevent the injury? How do you identify those most at risk and prevent the injury regardless of the environment in which they're operating? And that's going to be, as I said, a combination of understanding their predisposition to injury, the environment in which they're living, and then whatever the acute exposure is that might cause injury going forward. But I would hope that we can and must continue some of that domain-specific research, but really shift the focus more and more to preventing injury rather than where we've heavily focused in the past, and that's treating once the injury has occurred.
Thank you, General. I really appreciate your talk. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a psychiatrist. I retired from the Dutch Armed Forces. I'd like to hear you speak briefly, if you can, on the incredible mental health toll that we're seeing in these complex, ambiguous, and violent situations in Ukraine, across the world, and not only on the soldiers, but also on the leadership. Could you speak to that?
That's a remarkable question. So I'll first say I had a great pleasure of having dinner Monday night with the Surgeon General from the Netherlands. Jelle is a tremendous colleague. And we were talking about this, among other things. So, when we look at our experience in the U.S. military and with our allies over the last 20 years, one of the leading causes of illness and injury are mental health conditions of a variety. And some of them are acute stress reactions and, somewhat self-limited, but many of them have much longer-term conditions about which we're rightfully concerned and many of you are working to address. As I've had the opportunity to speak with my Ukrainian colleagues, the spectrum of mental health injuries that they're seeing is different than what we, as they describe it, different than what we have seen over the past 20 years in our forces operating in the Middle East, because the conflict is different. That's no great surprise. One of the things that we're working on is how to better capture as much of that data as possible to fully understand what they are experiencing in Ukraine. And I think there'll be similar opportunities in Turkey as we look at the extraordinary number of people, more than 1 million people now without homes, tens of thousands who are injured and will, in some cases, have very long-term recoveries, but potentially up to 23 million people impacted by this earthquake. As tragic as these events are, they're also great opportunities for us to expand our understanding of what 21st century mental health challenges will be so that we can better identify those optimal treatments for them. And so, I'll come back to one of the mantras that I stress in almost every talk that I give. The data, the evidence that we collect, and our shared ability to objectively look at that and understand what it's telling us is one of the most important contributions that we can make. The anecdotes are important, but having that truly well curated and collected data, I think is going to be one of the tremendous contributions of this decade, both from Ukraine, from what we're seeing in Turkey and other disasters. And I will put the pandemic in that category. You all know this better than I do. We are just beginning to understand some of the long-term neurologic sequelae of COVID infections. We've got tremendous work being done in that area, but how do you take someone who had COVID in 2020, who continues to have symptoms from that, and understand what the risk may be for other neurologic sequelae or damage? That's all work still to be done, but it's based off of having as robust a set of data as possible, and that'll come through collaborations with colleagues like you all, figuring out how to collect that data and then share it across disciplines. Yes, sir.
Thank you for an excellent talk. I am reminded of at the introduction of the nuclear submarine, when patients had acute appendicitis in the submarine, the traditional standard of care was surgery, and they said, we didn't want to do that, we're going to give IV antibiotics. And recently, there have been trials supported by PCORI and other entities saying maybe that's what we should be doing in civilian medicine too. And I think about the TBI issue where you've got individuals in Ukraine who may go days with conditions that in a normal setting we would deal with surgically. I wonder if we need to advance our research in medical treatment to resolve some of the issues that we currently target with surgery. For TBI, for example, there may be a druggable target to address hypertrophy. And so I wonder if there's some opportunity for some research and development in that area. And then second, I'd like to say that one of our challenges in the US is the logistics of getting. There are deserts and gardens for TBI care in the U.S., and if you have your TBI in the desert, you are treated poorly and have a poor outcome, and if you have it in the garden, you are treated well and have a good outcome. And you guys are addressing those issues through great logistical support for getting patients from the desert to the garden.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And as you were talking, my mind was racing there. So in your discussion about deserts and gardens, I'd offer, I've had the great privilege, 37 years in uniform now. I've literally practiced above the Arctic Circle, worked with the National Science Foundation at supporting medical care at the South Pole, in combat and academic centers, and all sorts of other austere locations around the world. I'll come back to a comment that I made just a moment ago. Where we are best is where we work together. You know, the collaboration among committed colleagues when we choose to focus on the patient and try to understand what's the best that we can do in that environment is where we've had the greatest successes. Where we try to defend the orthodoxy, where we say this is the right answer because this is the way we've always done it, I think we do a tremendous disservice to our patients, and we ignore the reality that the majority of patients are not at a world-class first world medical center. You know, when you treat someone in a cave, you're immediately reminded that all of those things that you have at home are just not available. When you're treating someone, when you're actively trying to not get killed, you have a real focus on survival and on what you can do with what you have. And I think your point about how can we leverage that research and bring it back to those austere environments, whether it's here in the medical deserts in the United States or it's in the plethora of places around the world that are relatively underserved, again, highlights the value of the sort of collaboration that occurs at meetings like this. You know, I was at a meeting with some international medical leaders from large healthcare systems around the world about 6 months ago. These were from every continent. Some of the largest healthcare systems in the world. And every one of them is struggling with workforce shortages. There's simply not enough nurses, skilled physicians with the appropriate types of skills for the complexity of patient care challenges that we're seeing. Every meeting that I go to, there's supply chain challenges. We may think that, you know, we're immune to that, but I will assure you that even here in the United States, we were just yesterday lamenting the fact that we are trying to place an order for medical equipment to send to Ukraine. The earliest that any manufacturer can provide it is May. May. And that's a best case scenario. You know, so we really do need to both continue to look for what's the optimal solution when all of the best characteristics of our healthcare system occur. But what's the realistic solution when the real world in which the majority of people exist? And that's why the question about R&D is so important. You know, the solutions that we develop through our research protocols cannot be focused solely on those at the tremendous tertiary hospitals that we have in the major metropolitan areas. They must also address what's best in those remote and austere environments.
Good morning. My name is Allison McKinney. I am a adolescent and pediatric HIV specialist and was working in Malawi for 8 years when I fell ill with encephalitis. That led to a massive cytokine storm and essentially ravaged my brain. We flew back to the US eventually after a month in the ICU in Johannesburg, and every doctor we saw was kind of at the end of what they could offer, but they all made the same similar comment: you are just like a soldier with a blast injury. And so my parents and I, and you know, not wanting to stop and have this be the end of where I could go in rehabilitation, went to the VA in Houston and said, what are you doing for your soldiers? What are you doing for your veterans? And that was how we ended up getting connected with our team that I now see up in Chicago, with using glasses and vision therapy and whatnot. But I think what we had discovered was how hard it was to find those intersections between military medicine and things that are offered civilians and vice versa. And a lot of the things that we've now found that have worked for me, we realize aren't available for either veterans or otherwise. And a lot of my practitioners that we have would be like, oh, you know, these protocols we're using came from the Department of Defense. So it's been amazing to see that that collaboration is happening, but I feel like it is still so difficult as a patient to try to access, to find, and whatnot. And then the other thing that I thought was very interesting when you made the same allusion to encephalitis and your TBIs that you guys are seeing in the military, can you also elaborate more on the knowledge sharing between the two? Because I feel like that connection isn't always made with how similar brain injuries are.
Yeah, so first, it's exciting to see that your rehabilitation appears to be going well, and that's very good news. And when you said Malawi, I thought you might be going a different direction, because as some of you are tracking, there's a tremendous cholera outbreak in Malawi right now that's now spreading to other countries. And part of what we do in the military is we help with all sorts of things, along with our Centers for Disease Control and Agency for International Development, World Health Organization, and others. And it really gets to the crux of your question. How do we build multidisciplinary teams, both within our individual institutions, within our communities, within our nations, but then around the world? The most profound breakthroughs that I've seen in my lifetime are the ones where like-minded people, again, committed to great patient care, set aside their parochial biases and choose to say, how do we do this better across disciplines? That partnership between public health, traumatic brain injury diagnosis and treatment, and combat care for us is a very important one. Within the military, we have what's called the Joint Trauma System, which curates all of our data and looks at it. But we've actually brought in our mental health colleagues because we agree with you that there's a really important nexus there, along with our public health colleagues, so that when we write clinical practice guidelines, they acknowledge the reality that that complex human being with a specific injury often has multiple other conditions that they're experiencing at the same time. And just given the incidence of mental health conditions, that's one of the most likely ones that will occur. So we're trying to ensure that our internal work acknowledges that reality as we develop our best practices that we share. And we try to be very transparent in sharing those clinical practice guidelines. All of them are posted, available to anyone who has access to the web. For our Ukrainian colleagues, we've translated all of them into Ukrainian with the help of some colleagues from Ukraine, and made those available there, as well as into a number of other languages around the world. They become the underpinning for clinical practice guidelines that NATO is using and other key allies and partners. So we're continuing to try and share what we develop as widely as possible. We work very closely with the VA, and you may have seen that we have DoD VA clinical practice guidelines that, again, we make widely available. All of that is still insufficient, you're right, because if you're an individual patient out there, how would you know to go to the DoD Joint Trauma System to find the clinical practice guideline for a particular condition? And that's work still to be done in helping patients navigate both the U.S. healthcare system and the healthcare system in other countries. So thank you for highlighting that, and I agree it's something that collectively we should continue to focus on.
An excellent, an excellent talk, and I think you very nicely highlighted a number of changes, both in terms of the nature of injuries and also the mindset of the aggressors these days. I work on the effect of radiation on the brain, mainly in the context of NASA's space missions. And the one thing that I think we're thinking about seriously for the first time in many years is the possibility of nuclear weapons being deployed. And given the rapid advances that we've seen in our knowledge of how the brain works, and particularly the effect of low-dose radiation on brain function, how concerned are you about, or are you building into the possibility of a radiation component and how that's going to affect the sequelae of the other injuries?
So, it would be easy to be very depressed in my job. Because every day, what we do is we look around the world and say, what's the next horrible thing that's happening or could happen, and how are we preparing for it or responding to it? So yes, are we thinking about that, and are we doing research on that? Absolutely. But I'll tell you that I'm actually incredibly optimistic. And as I get closer to the end than to the beginning of my career, and I look at where our colleagues are, especially our younger colleagues, the practice of medicine is changing for the better. If we can constrain the misinformation that's undermining the trust in our work, we are on the cusp, I think, of revolutionizing what we're able to do for our patients, both for and with our patients. I'm incredibly optimistic when I look at how we can leverage AI and machine learning to deliver truly personalized healthcare instead of broad population healthcare. Both important, but I think that we are approaching the point where we can deliver the things that many of us have hoped for our entire careers. So do I worry about it? Sure, absolutely. But I'm actually much more optimistic today than I was even 10 years ago as I look at where we are in evolving and improving the practice of medicine. And I'll close by saying thanks to all of you, because you're giving me that optimism. The work that you're doing is proving that we are indeed on the cusp of revolutionizing how we care for those, whether it's with neurological conditions, urological conditions, those that they develop in space travel. This is an exciting time to be in healthcare. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, General, for great comments and great lecture here. We're going to go to a break, and then the next session will start. Thank you.